Okay. Thank you all for coming. This is really great. I'm really excited about what we're doing. I just wanted to give a brief introduction to what we're planning to do today, but also a little recap of what we did in the first workshop, because not everybody was there. Who's here today was not there at the first workshop. So the first thing that I have to do is I realized that when I was making this, I hadn't updated the logo. And now we have to switch to the University of Exeter, so the University of Nottingham. So we'll do that and make sure that that's official on the next one. Right. So just a reminder of the overall aims of the network as a whole. What we want to do is really try to examine the Norman Conquest explicitly through a material culture lens, through what archaeology can bring to the cultural and social and political questions about what's going on in the 11th and 12th centuries. We don't want to limit ourselves just to the question of the military conquest or even the cultural integration, but really the kind of long period around on both sides of the Norman Conquest in the 11th and 12th centuries, because as we discussed in the first workshop, there's a lot of European trends that are going on at this time, which the conquest is but one event within that. The overall goal of the project is to articulate an archaeological research framework for these centuries that we can use to promote the study of this period to other archaeologists who are not doing it as often as I think probably all of us would agree they should be doing, and also to interdisciplinary audiences. So something that we can use to attract historians, art historians, anthropologists, literary people that are working in this field, to show them that we have something to contribute. The other main point of it was to bring together all the disparate arms of archaeology that often don't talk to each other as well as they should. So the academic and the professional sides, but then also within archaeology, those of us who tend towards the more humanistic side of archaeology, as well as those who do the hard science. And also thinking about the public engagement side of things and how we can tell stories that are interesting about the material culture and the archaeology of this period to the public. And the main thing is, as Naomi says, to get our act together, to make sure that we can start talking effectively about this period with other archaeologists and other disciplines. And it's running from last June through December of this year. So there were several, I circulated that document, that sort of working document on agendas, but I've summarized some of it here about what came out of that first workshop. And so everybody's on the same page, so we kind of see what the ideas were that came out of that. And I asked a series of questions during the brainstorming sessions. And one of them was, what do we need to do better? What are we not doing now that we need to do? And chronologies and dating came up a lot. Not necessarily that they have to be more precise, but if we can make them more precise, that's better. But when they can't be precise, which we have to acknowledge they won't always be, to deal better with those uncertainties and to figure out a way to deal with those gaps and uncertainties. We need to use a much wider array of methods than we've been, and often be more systematic than we've been. Communication was the other major theme that came up. To disseminate better, to speak to the public more, to communicate with other archaeologists, other arms of archaeology better, and hopefully these workshops are starting to do some of that, but we're going to have to continue to do that even outside of a kind of focused project like this. To not be afraid to tell our own materially based stories in this period, to not feel shackled by the historical record. That doesn't mean ignoring it. It doesn't mean pretending it doesn't exist, but to not feel bound by it, I think. As well, we need to think about wider scope and context, being international, thinking much bigger as well as much smaller, thinking about what's going on beyond the event of the Norman Conquest, thinking about much longer term processes when we're asking questions about it. And getting better at messaging, getting better at communicating to other archaeologists and to the public that material culture is as significant as the wealth of documentation that surrounds the Norman conquest, that we are as important to understanding this period as history is. The major impediments that have stopped us doing this, a lack of precision in dating that sometimes is unconvincing to people who aren't archaeologists, to the public. If we can't definitely say something happened before the conquest or after the conquest, it's been seen as less useful in a way. The lack of provenance in artifacts in a lot of cases. There's a lot of material in museums, in art museums, that's 11th and 12th century that we're not really using because it hasn't come out of the ground with a context. In our own interpretations, we've sometimes been over-reliant on the received documentary narrative, so our tendency to do that. There are preconceptions that stem from rigid terminology about what we think we mean by things like Anglo-Saxon or the Norman conquest, and that tends to narrow our focus. Structural constraints are a big thing. We can do what we can to try to overcome them, but the pressures of things like the ref and where you need to publish and who you need to publish for, siloing that happens because of the way that universities hire or slot us into particular areas can often hamper interdisciplinarity and the links we want to make. Our dissemination practices are a big impediment. It came up a lot that archaeologists are generally happy to read historical writing journals and cite them and things like that, but we often don't get cited in return in those same things. So we need to think about how we can make ourselves more visible and entice people from other disciplines to read us. And that we're generally lacking confidence in this period because it's been such a focus for historians. We think either that it's understood and we don't need to really add anything, or that we're not really necessary in this discussion. So we need to be more confident that we have something to contribute. Why other people should care? Why archaeology is so good in this period and why other people should care is that it's an exceptionally rich period for both material culture and documentation. We have enormous amounts of raw material to work with. And so this is a really good lab to test interdisciplinarity, to test theories, and to test methods. The most obvious thing for why historians should care is that we can get to things and people that documents can't. We might be able to tell smaller stories, untold stories. We can pinpoint maybe regional variation that's not going to show up in documents that are working at a much higher level. And then there are a number of themes that really emerge from the Norman conquest that are relevant to basically any period of archaeology or human study. Social, political, and cultural transitions and how material culture captures those or plays a role in those, as well as things like migration, displacement, contact, identity, and those are relevant from prehistory until the present. And the other thing is that whether we like it or not, it's a defining moment. It's a cultural touchstone. It's an event, and it gives you a hook to hang funding on, which, we say that we might have to pitch it as this is all about the Norman conquest, but then once you get the money, then you sneakily make it about a lot of other things that aren't the Norman conquest. And so what do we want to do? We want to move beyond just documenting the Norman conquest in material culture. We want to ask more questions about why and how it happened, what roles material culture played, why certain things changed and why other things stayed the same. Not just saying this happened in the 11th century and this happened in the 12th century, the Norman conquest happened in between, therefore it must be the Norman conquest. We want to make better use of data that already exists that we're not really dealing with very well at the moment. Museum collections, site reports, grey literature, unit archives from commercial archaeology. Look beyond Britain, particularly beyond England, to the other countries in the UK, but also across the Channel into Europe. Make links between multiple forms of data and evidence and bring them all together. One of my questions was, what sorts of evidence should we be prioritizing? And somebody wrote, we shouldn't be prioritizing anything. We should be bringing all of it together as much as possible. We need to think both bigger and smaller, looking at wider contexts as well as regional variation, microhistories and archaeologies. thinking about the impact of the Norman conquest on personal and group identities and how those might be showing up in the material culture. What's the conquest relevance to modern issues? I think, particularly in the European debates that we're having at the moment, debates about genetics and ethnicity and identity, we can really tap into some of those issues, and we shouldn't be afraid to do so. And perhaps deconstructing even the idea or the importance of the Norman conquest in the popular and academic mindset. So what we're going to do today is have first in the morning a discussion of a range of possible methods and approaches which have the potential to really transform what we do in this period. Many of them haven't been utilized in the 11th and 12th centuries much at all, or even applied specifically to ask questions about what's going on in the Norman conquest. Particularly some of the scientific techniques that need to be brought to bear a little bit more. And some are traditional techniques which are being rethought and refined about dating of artifacts and things like that. So what we want to do in the afternoon particularly is combine the new ideas emerging from the presentations today with those Workshop 1 agendas and brainstorm priorities for what we're going to do in the future. So that we can update that research agenda document that's circulating around and start the seeds of a larger funding application, which we promised the AHRC we would do. So,
but there can be many applications.
But there could be many applications. Yeah. So yeah, this is just starting to think about that process. All right. Okay, and so now I'm going to hand over